Igor, let me turn to you. A big theme, Mr. Trump's interview seemed to be hedging on some of the broad promises he made in the campaign. He now says that he'll keep some of the president's health care law instead of repealing and replacing it. He also says he'd accept a fence rather than wall on some parts of our southern border. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it suggests that he just really hasn't thought through the implications of these policies. You saw in the interview him really hedging, not having a strong sense of what exactly he wants to do. You know, he's in a position now where literally kind of the weight of the world is on his shoulders, certainly the country. And not only does he not have a firm position on any of those issues, but he didn't even clearly ask his supporters to stop all the violence that's been going on in the country. I mean, 200 incidents of violence, of white supremacist violence, anti-Latino violence, and he gave this kind of check-the-box reply, just stop, but didn't call on them in any serious way, didn't appeal to their better nature to really just end this kind of behavior, and in fact reinforced it with the Bannon appointment. So, you know, I think it's all very disappointing.
Leslie, at the same time, you and I both traveled to the U.S.-Mexico border and spoke with Latinos for Trump for our CBSN documentary, and you remember what they said, that the border wall discussion to them was just a point of negotiation, that it wasn't something they necessarily believed he was serious about doing, and so they were willing to forgive and overlook some of the harsh rhetoric that they'd been hearing because they felt in the end he would have been the candidate. He was the person who could actually have a change happen under his administration.
That is the most important, if not the most pivotal point of the entire immigration conversation, which very few people made that point during this debate, and that was that Donald Trump could do something that no other Republican has been able to do successfully, at least going back to '96, and that is bring all the disparate parts together to have some meaningful reform. He's looking at, and that was very much the pass that people were willing to give him on the border. They said, look, we already have border fencing. If you live down here, La Frontera, like if you understand this region between Mexico and the United States, then it's a very different dynamic. We already have fencing. We already have a lot of enforcement. We already have a lot of technology, but things are not working. We need to look at interior enforcement. We need to look at number of criminal aliens here and prioritize this problem so that we can fundamentally get it resolved. And I think that's the benefit of the doubt that folks that live on the border were willing to give to Donald Trump, and hopefully the rest of the country will as well.
John, let me ask you about this notion of making campaign promises and then appearing to sort of back off some of them. I was just looking at a list of some of the things that President Obama promised when he was campaigning: closing Guantanamo Bay, providing a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. Those things have not happened under his administration. What do you make of what it is that we heard from President-elect Trump about some of these campaign promises?
Well, and there's a key difference here between the promises that Barack Obama didn't fulfill and the ones that Donald Trump is already starting to back away from, which is President Obama made a real effort to do the things that he promised. Most presidents, once they get elected, actually try to pursue the platforms on which they campaigned. So in terms of closing Guantanamo Bay, President Obama made an effort to do that. In terms of getting comprehensive immigration reform, President Obama attempted to do that. He was blocked in Congress. Donald Trump is backing away on his own, and we'll just have to see how that plays out. I think some of these are floats, if you will. These basically floating to see how much he can back away from some of these promises before it angers his base. You know, whether or not he builds a wall or whether it's a wall with some fencing, whether he deports 3 million people in his earliest days as president, I think we're still going to have to see how that all plays out.
Leslie, I want to go back to you on this notion of Steve Bannon as senior counselor and chief strategist. How do you think that will be received in some quarters, despite what we just said about how some of his supporters, his Latino supporters, Hispanic supporters, were willing to overlook some of the harsh rhetoric? Others, as you well know, as we've seen across the country, there have been demonstrations. Other people who have opposed Donald Trump from the beginning are alarmed to see Steve Bannon in the White House. What would you, what does that say? What kind of message does that send, having Steve Bannon in that position?
You know, I really want to take this back. These were exactly the same types of criticisms people said about Karl Rove when George W. Bush was putting the chief strategist in the White House. It was going to manipulate the whole process. It was going to be to the detriment of the president. It's too early to tell. I think there's some fairness in all of those arguments and looking at people's past record. But I don't think it's fair to say that President-elect Trump hasn't denounced some of these extreme radical groups that do not belong in the national discourse and in his agenda. He denounced it in the primary and on the media, and everybody else was still very critical. He didn't denounce it enough when some of these KKK robocalls were happening. And again, you see him directly look into the camera and say, stop it. He doesn't want to do it. It's his cadence. It's his style. Could it have been more eloquent? Could he have written a speech? Could he have come out in a way that perhaps President Barack Obama would do and make a national conversation like he did on race? Sure, maybe he will do that. But I think we're still learning his style and trying to take him at his word. Elaine, you bring up an important point, though. It's like, how do you take him at his word when sometimes he's kind of, he'll say one thing and then we're kind of moving around the edges. I think this is all a transition for all of us, and we have to give Trump the benefit of the doubt in this case.
Which is what Hillary Clinton essentially
Elaine,
said.
can I say something about the...
Yeah, I think Igor actually... go ahead, John. Go ahead.
I was just going to say on the point about Bannon, in the time since we started this segment, somebody tweeted at us a picture of a cartoon of Donald Trump holding up the decapitated head of a stereotypically Jewish-looking person. And this is the kind of people that Steve Bannon has rallied to Donald Trump's cause and, like I said before, catered to over time. So this isn't, this isn't a situation where you're talking about a Karl Rove whose politics one might not agree with. You're talking about somebody who is a leader of the white nationalist movement in this country moving into the White House. People call it the alt-right. And that's a sanitized version. These are white supremacists.
Igor, you wanted to weigh in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly the point. I would call on Leslie and all other Republicans whose job it is to go on these shows and defend Donald Trump, not to defend Bannon and not to defend the kinds of things that Bannon stands for, whether it be the white nationalism, the white supremacy, the anti-Semitism that he's been accused of. The cartoon that John talked about that he got on Twitter, I get all the time when I tweet from people who support Trump. And again, the instances of violence we see in this country against black people, Latino people, Muslim people, this is what Bannon is about. And Leslie and everybody, all the other Republicans who are going to be on these talk shows talking about this on Monday, it's up to them to stand up and say no. And it's up to people like Paul Ryan
Elaine,
to say no. We're not going to stand for this, and this is not okay.
If we could, I think that's a completely unfair observation to me or any other Republican or anyone else.
He's not a white nationalist?
No,
I'm sorry, he's an admitted white nationalist.
I am so far from defending that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where President-elect Trump is going to move. And I think if you watch a lot of CBSN, you'll find out that we're extremely objective and we kind of, call balls and strikes both ways. What we're saying right now is that it's a time for the country to come together and give the benefit of the doubt to see what he does, see how this shapes out. And those are very fair conversation points, but no one here is defending Bannon and his ideas. We have no idea, but we're trying to take President-elect Trump at his word, what he says about this violence, what he said about these tweets, what he said about those robocalls. And that's where we're trying to go, I think, in a healthy conversation that moves it forward. But it remains to be seen. I think that's why I'm saying there's fair points on both sides. We're cautiously optimistic, I think, as Americans, that this goes in a more positive direction and it's a balanced and fair direction.
Yes, well, I'll be watching very closely to see what role Steve Bannon plays in the days ahead. I want to thank our first panel, including CBSN political contributor Leslie Sanchez, John Allen, a columnist with Roll Call, as well as Igor Volsky, who is the Deputy Director for the Center for American Progress Action Fund.